We have Robert Stegemann, otherwise known as Bob Stegemann, joining us today. And while Bob is now retired and living in Saranac Lake with his wife, his career did span both public and private sectors, including working with the Tug Hill Commission, Empire State Forest Products Association, Internal Paper, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. In all of these positions, Bob's work sought to find solutions to the environmental and economic demands. Early in his career, he worked for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management as a smoke jumper, firefighting fires in Alaska and the Northwest. And he holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Union College, and his master's is from SUNY ESF in resource management and policy. Welcome to the podium, Bob.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. And I can't tell you how psyched I am to talk about this subject. We have a great group of panelists today. And when I was getting ready for this talk, I said, well, it seems like I'm not very original, because I said, well, the hazy skies will be a good opener. And then I found this article that was in the paper just a couple days ago about the Long Lake West fires in 1908. I was going to talk about those, but you all know about that already, so I won't do that. But it is a good opening this is a good setting for why are we talking about this subject. Having a little experience in firefighting, and I got to say, I'll qualify by saying it was more than 4 decades ago, but I do know that fire is a really interesting creature, and it's the things we've heard today about both being destructive but also very helpful and needed in the ecology of a forest and the landscape. And it's managing that interface, which is so important. Back when I was fighting fire, the concept of let burn was just starting. And there was some let burn areas that they let burn that, got away from them. And now we have a village or a city that was being threatened, and all the troops had to come out and put it out. So it was kind of it is an interesting dynamic to have a fire, having fire, managing fire, and recognizing both the pluses and minuses of it, and then figuring out how to do that in a way that actually comes out right. Back there's a lot of history in fire behavior and studying fire and understanding fire. And maybe some of you have heard of a fire that was quite famous called the Man Gulch Fire in Montana in 1949, when 13 smoke jumpers were perished. That was pretty much the spark plug that got the science of forest fire behavior going. And there's a fire research center now in Missoula. But that was when they started saying, what are the factors? And the factors that I remember as a firefighter is humidity, temperature, availability of fuel, and a spark, some kind of fire source. And if you look at those first 3, our ace in the hole in the Adirondacks is moisture, and so humidity and rain, those are going for us. But like we've heard in discussions already, when you have maybe a confluence of factors that are not normal for a particular year, but drought, and your humidity is very low, and you have a spark, we don't have the trains we used to have, but we do have more people in the woods and open fires that are not put out. Carelessness, that's sort of a human nature. And so I think that it begs the question, are we going to have another big fire? And if we have a confluence of some of these conditions of a real drought, real dry area, and have fuel available, there's going to be plenty of fuel available. We don't have the down timber that we used to, but we do have blowdowns, and we do have years and years of accumulated fuel. So anyway, to get into it, joining us today, we have a great panel. We have some people who have expertise in managing land and understand how to manage the land, and they're going to be addressing some questions today that you'll see up on the board in a minute. But the general areas of them is, what would a wildfire in the Adirondacks look like today? How would we respond? And how can we help Adirondack communities prepare for wildfire? And how can we bolster our resistance to the consequences of a big fire? Coming to us from Paul Smith, we have from Paul Smith College, we have Justin Waskowitz, who I really enjoyed reading his bio, who is an associate professor of forestry with a focus on, among other things, fire ecology. He did some of his undergraduate and master's work in Arizona and studied fire under fire-dependent ponderosa pine ecosystems. And Justin, I didn't tell you this, but I did a term paper on that in grad school too. He completed his Ph.D. in Maine in 2011, and he's studying species composition on oak pine forests that were predicated by the 1947 fire and what's happened since then. We also have, maybe we were talking about maybe our speakers coming up as I introduce. Yep, so we can grab a seat. And Angela's not here, right? Okay. I think on the program we might have Angelo Johnson, who was from the tribal community forester from St. Regis Mohawks, but he's not present today, so we'll move on to the other one. I have Tom Curial, who is from Lime Timber, or Lime Adirondack Forest Company, which, by the way, was the successor owner of the International Paper Lands, where I worked for a lot of years. He has a degree from Paul Smith's, and he's the forest operations manager. Paul Smith's in forest operations and in wildland firefighting. He works on prescribed burns and unintentionally set wildland fires in Franklin and Essex counties. So welcome, and come on up, Tom. And then lastly, we have Lizz Schuyler, Supervisor of Natural Resources at the Adirondack Park Agency. She has a Ph.D. in wildlife science from Oregon State University. I looked at that school. That's a great place. Doctoral research examined the ecological consequences of fire and invasive species and the role of natural disturbance, particularly wildfire in shaping wildlife dynamics and ecosystem recovery. Prior to the agency, Lizz was a professor in wildlife ecology at Paul Smith's College. So welcome, Lizz. Okay, so we have several questions that we're going to be talking about, and we're going to try and keep responses by each participant to a couple minutes each for each one. And so I'll start with the first one. What would a wildfire in the Adirondacks look like today?
So as Bob said, my name's Tom Curiali. I work for Lime Adirondack Forest Company. We are currently the largest private landowner in New York State, managing approximately 234,000 acres of industrial timberland throughout the Adirondack Park. Of that, I'm stationed over in the Champlain Valley, based out of Elizabethtown. I manage about 48,000 acres. So as I'm thinking through the questions here for this conference and the likelihood of this happening in the Adirondacks, we have a pretty good land base to look at to see, is this something that actually happens to us? In talking with some foresters who have been with us much longer than I have, I've only been here 3 years, but in talking with some people who have been on our property managing for over 20 years, over the last 20-year span, we've had less than 100 acres burned property-wide. We don't have the trains running through our properties that we used to. We don't have the logging practices that create the slash like we used to. One of the things that attributes lack of fuel loading on our properties is that we have a low-grade market, as they didn't in the past, where we can send wood down to 4-inch small diameter to Ticonderoga to be turned into pulp and paper. And so we're not leaving slash in the woods that we did back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So much of this answer is not uniform. It really depends on the property you're looking at. It depends on the forest conditions and on the cover type. Additionally, as we look at what would influence the spread of a fire were it to ignite on industrial timberland across the property, we have a lot more fire breaks now than we did historically, because we have infrastructure in place to get logging operations across the property. Our three main activities as our company are timber harvesting operations, recreational land leasing, and log sorting and marketing. In order to do that timber harvesting at a property-wide scale, we have road infrastructure that gets tractor trailers in and out of our property. That road infrastructure also supports getting suppression apparatus and mobilizing resources across our property as needed should a wildfire occur. To Phil's point from earlier, we cut a lot of the spruce out earlier in the 1900s and the end of the 1800s, cut a lot of the softwood out. So the forest types that are very prone to fire on our property don't exist as much as they used to. We're working in a lot of northern hardwood stands at this point, company-wide, and those are not as prone to fire as spruce fir stands or as white pine stands may be. In addition, we have a lot of people around, more people than we did in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So these fires are more easily detected quickly, and we can mobilize resources a lot faster than we historically have been able to.
Thank you. So what would a wildfire look like today? Well, it would probably be the scale and the intensity of it would be, like mentioned earlier, a lot smaller than we would see out west. But it could still be damaging depending on how close the proximity is to a community. And kind of mentioned before, the likelihood that the fire would be started would probably be by a campfire. So there's data on the DEC website that shows that in the park, 60% to 71% of the fires in the park have started from a campfire. So that's a good outreach message when you do see other people with fires going. But really, there's so many conditions that can be a factor that we've heard today. So what type of vegetation is it? What are the climate and weather conditions? What is the topography? But one great thing that we have in the park, and which makes the Adirondack Park so unique, is that we have natural fire breaks. We have 3,000 lakes and ponds. We have 30,000 miles of rivers and streams. And it isn't that a fire couldn't jump that, but generally we do have humidity that's over 30%, and that also helps with keeping things, a fire, at bay. The likelihood that we would see some sort of a crown fire is not very high, but what we see even this summer, on Lower Saranac, is we'll see these duff fires that can spread and are kind of hard to detect in the ecosystem.
So the answer to the first question, what would a wildfire look like in the Adirondacks? The answer is more questions. Where does the fire start? What time of year does the fire start? What year does the fire start? Is it a drought year? Is it an ordinary year? And one of the big questions, too, is what do you mean by a fire? Because we have them. That's not a hypothetical. We have about 30 fires a year within the Adirondacks. So I think what we're generally talking about is big fires, something like 1903 or 1908 again. Our previous speakers did point out that those were not single fires, although there's a tendency to talk about the 1903 fire or the 1908 fire. It's really the 1903 fire year, the 1908 fire year. And if you looked at that map, there were hundreds of fires, right? So any one blob of red on that map, even that is probably multiple ignitions that have come together. So a fire that's big enough to make the headlines, big enough to do damage, maybe a 5-digit acreage sort of fire here, is unlikely but not impossible. We have got the fuels. The weather conditions can occur. They're not terribly common, but you can get an extreme drought. If that follows a windstorm or something, if you have this and this and this, if you have a confluence of conditions, you can get a fire that might go up to that size. But even then, you're still missing something else. That's likely the ignitions. We have ignition sources. We have people out there leaving campfires going. But to get a situation like 1903 or 1908, those aren't single-point ignitions. Even those blobs of 40,000 acres probably obscure a mass start of several smaller fires that have converged. You'd have to have an army of negligent campers going out there and igniting a whole bunch of fires in one place to get it to converge to that kind of acreage. It's possible, but pretty unlikely. So it's not something I lose sleep over. So what's the likelihood? Yeah, low, not zero, but low. And what would influence its spread? Topography. Well, fire behavior is driven by topography, weather, and fuels. And weather is variable year to year. The topography here is very varied. We have lakes and we have rivers and we have a significant amount of road system that's very different from northern Quebec. That is truly wilderness. There's long spans of very homogeneous forest type. And that's the other thing. We have different forest types on the north slope than on the south slope, on the high end versus the low end. So we have a lot of heterogeneity. We'll talk a lot about fuel accumulation, but it's not so much the amount of fuel that matters. It's the type of fuel and the arrangement of that fuel. So you may say there's tons and tons of fuel out there, but a lot of that mass is large logs. Those aren't important in spreading fire. They have other important ecological effects, but they're not what causes a fire to spread long distances. We have different types of fuel. So hardwood litter versus softwood litter. We have a lot of hardwood forests now. That is very different than in 1906, and it's very different, or 1908, and it's very different than 1808 or 1708. The forest today is different than it was before. So the quality of the fuels, the energy content of the fuels, the way those fuels pack, and then arrangement matters. So part of the reason fires get so big out west is continuity. So we talk about horizontal continuity, the ability of the flames to move from one fuel patch to another fuel patch across the landscape, and then also importantly vertical continuity, the ability of flames to rise up from surfaces where all fires start on the surface, and then some of them go down into duff fires and some of them go up into crown fires, but you have to have a continuity of fuels vertically to make that happen. And the Adirondacks, part of what makes it so beautiful to us is that it's so diverse and interesting, and that diversity in spatial structure is also kind of a saving grace when it comes to the potential for large fires.
Thank you all for your responses. We'll roll on to our next question.
Okay, I'm going to just make one last comment on that panel, and I didn't bring it up in my intro remarks, and I should have, and that is today's fire level that we have is managed quite well, I think, by our rangers, who are experts at putting fires out. And I guess at what point, the question is, at what point does that become overwhelmed if we have these kind of situations we're talking about? Okay, so the next question, let's just look at a scenario where we have 500 acres are currently burning in the St. Regis Canoe area. A ground fire is burning deep within the duff layer, and high winds are fueling the spread of a rapidly growing crown fire. What do we do? What do you think an emergency response would look like, and how do we contain the spread?
So to the point of what do we do, in New York State, we put our fires out. What that looks like for us, as to Lizz's point, there's a lot of natural breaks within the St. Regis canoe area. It's a canoe area because there's a lot of water there. There's not roads run through there already. There's not giant fire breaks put in by heavy equipment. So we're going to initially rely on using those natural breaks, using those natural water features as stops, and then working around that to contain the fire. When you need to put a fire out, you're trying to remove one wall of the fire tetrahedron. Well, the things in the fire tetrahedron are oxygen, heat, a chemical reaction, and fuel. What we're going to typically do to put a wildfire out in an area where it's pretty hard to get water there is remove the fuel. What does that look like? Initially, with the ranger response, that looks like cutting hand lines in the ground with hand crews. Somebody goes through first with a chainsaw, removes the larger fuels, then you go through with ever-decreasing intensity of hand tools till you're down to your bare mineral soil layer that's no longer going to burn. You move out of hand crews, now you're looking into heavy equipment. You're looking into dozers responding and cutting bigger fire lines in as flame lengths get larger. If you're trying to put out a duff fire that's down in a ground fire, so below the surface, you're not up in the canopy, you're not on the surface that you're seeing, but you're actually buried down in, you could just remove that duff layer and a little bit around it, and you're pretty well set. If you're up into a big raging crown fire, you need to cut a fire line that's 2 or 3 times the width of the flame length, and that's going to take some pretty heavy equipment to do. And that's going to be some arduous work. So in the case of the St. Regis canoe area, we're really looking at using our natural fire breaks. I'll tie this back to a little more of my understanding on industry land. A lot of those natural fire breaks we rely on are our roads because our roads are down to gravel, down to soil. It's not something that's going to burn. So you're trying to put something in that's akin to a road. Tying into the second part of this, what does the emergency response look like? Headed off by the rangers, being in the St. Regis canoe area, being on state land, with assistance of local fire departments. The rangers will call in resources from around the state and out of state if needed, and then local fire departments will rely on their internal resources and then also the state mutual aid plan to bring in different fire departments from around the county and around surrounding counties as needed.
That was like the perfect answer. So I don't have a lot to add, but I did end up calling for this question specifically Captain Scott Jackson just to get his opinion on he's a forest ranger for this area, and just to get his opinion on what they would do. So he did talk exactly about what you said with the duff layer. What I found interesting is that usually is like 3 to 4 feet. That's how deep these trenches have to be to actually stop the fire. That's how deep the duff can be. So that's no easy feat. He did say, though, that we are lucky that we have so much water. So even, especially in this canoe area, they can just put a pump right in the lake and pump from the lake, and that's called drafting and direct control. Indirect control would be this fire break. And that's generally when there's a worry that the fire is moving towards some sort of development, either a home, maybe the campus, something like that. So, but no matter what, there would be a response to put the fire out, which is a lot different than like a federal response and how forests are managed out west. And I think that's it.
As with a lot of things, I think the answer is more questions. So we, looking at the wording there, what do we got? Am I looking at would, could, or should? How would we put the fire out is a different answer than how could we put a fire out versus should we put the fire out. If this is in a wilderness area, my inclination is to say, let it go, right? As long as it's not threatening anybody, get people out of the way. But this will add more heterogeneity to the landscape in the long run. I'm not terrified by a fire that is probably in that area pretty well contained already by natural topography. The could and the would is another matter. I think wood's been covered pretty well. There's a methodology to approaching fires. Generally involves that indirect attack of trying to contain it, breaking up that horizontal continuity of fuels so that it can't proceed further. What was the other would? No, I did should. Should, how would you? And then could. What could you do? So getting to the crown fire component of it, and actually the ground fire too. You can put out surface fires. Ground fires, you contain them and let them burn them out. You can't put enough water on them to put them out. It takes forever. Crown fires, they release, in some cases, nuclear bomb levels of energy. You're not going to put it out. You're going to steer it, maybe. Steer it toward a natural barrier, steer it a little bit on the margins, on the flanks. But you don't put those out either. You wait for the weather.
All right, and we have one final question for you all, and be thinking of the questions that you have, because we will also take questions from the audience once we conclude these answers.
Okay, what suggestions do you have to enhance our fire preparedness, response, and community resilience to wildfire in the Adirondacks?
I'll slightly play devil's advocate here and say really not many. As far as the concern that we have about this, and I'll speak to my experience on timber company property on lime timber, it hasn't been an issue for us historically. And things that we do already embedded in our current operations, our timber harvesting operations, our recreational land leasing operations, ancillarily install fire breaks. We have roads to get to all of our places. Those are good fire breaks. Those are good infrastructure pathways to get in suppression equipment. There's a lot of people around our land base. Fires detected relatively quickly nowadays with cell service throughout the park. You're not, somebody's not on horseback running a letter down to a train to try to get more resources coming out. You're calling 911 and everybody knows about it pretty quickly on. As far as timber harvesting operations, one thing I do day to day as I'm managing logging jobs is make sure that slash is managed appropriately. We're not doing the thing that happened in the early 1900s, the late 1800s, where you cut the butt log and the second log off a tree and the rest of it lays there. As I said earlier in the response to the first question, we process our roundwood down to a 4-inch, small little top diameter that goes to Ticonderoga to be turned into pulp. That's what we do on lime, and pulpwood is about the same throughout all industry property with what gets processed. So we're not leaving all that slash in the woods anymore. The slash that does get left in the woods, the limbs and tops that come out to log landings, they're skidded out, cut off. They're brought back in the woods and put in trails and run over. So they're knocked down. We're not leaving giant piles of slash haphazardly around our property. So we make sure that we're doing good practices with the fuel loads as far as also soil stabilization. Everything that Lime Timber does is managed to New York State Best Management Practice water quality and soil quality guidelines. So we're not running into big, or really any major erosion issues at all. We put water attenuation devices, water bars, back in our skid trails when we're done. So we're not putting giant skid canyons in the side of mountains. We're not creating giant landslides. We work within the Adirondack Park Agency regulations when it comes to our clear cuts. So we're not doing haphazard 70-acre clear cuts where we're taking the sides off whole mountains with no foresight. So a lot of the historical management practices in logging that caused fire in the Adirondacks are no longer occurring. As far as things I can suggest to other landowners, low thinnings, cutting the bottom out of a stand, cutting the junkier understory and midstory out of a stand, reduces the amount of what we call ladder fuels in the wildfire world, fuels that take a surface fire that's down on the ground and bring it up into the canopy. So a lot of good forestry practices consist of cutting out the junk trees out of a stand, which are those smaller, lower, poorly self-pruned softwoods that are going to cause surface fires to ladder up into the canopy. So as long as we stick with good forestry practices as we do now, as long as we stick with good water quality and soil quality management practices, this is not something that is of a huge concern to me, especially on industrial forest land.
Thank you. Okay, I had come up with 4 topics that we could do for community resilience. And one is to have a community wildfire protection plan. I don't know how many villages and hamlets and towns in the park have one, but there is a really great reference on the FEMA website. They actually have an example of how to start one. So if you go back to your town and you don't have one, maybe this is something you'd like to bring up with your local planning officials. Another one, which was you touched on really well, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, is vegetation and fuel management. So really encouraging landowners to adopt fire-wise landscaping. There are also ideas of developing and sustaining markets for low-grade wood products to help support reduction through thinning operations that would otherwise be non-economical. Workshops and conferences for public awareness. So this is perfect, being able to spread the word and to learn. I've learned so much already today. And then drawing from my time living in Oregon, there's really simple things that you can do on your property to make your house safe. So if there's a tree within a certain proximity, I don't know it off the top of my head, maybe you guys do, but in a certain amount of feet, you just don't have big trees butting up against your garage or your house, or giant branches overhanging. I mean, you don't want that usually for wind damage, which is probably more likely to happen at your house than a fire, but make sure your gutters aren't full of flammable material. Make sure that you're not storing your firewood under your deck or right alongside your garage. Have your, that fuel base set away. And then have a little bit of openness right directly around your house so that it's just like an automatic fuel break. And having that, and if the entire community had fire-wise practices on their own landscape, then that can really help with, if a fire did break through, you could help with with the first responders.
Well, as you probably already know, this isn't something I lose a lot of sleep over. So policy-wise, I think if the people of New York were really truly scared and concerned about this, the sort of things that you would have to do to reduce the already small fire risk within New York would not sit well for other reasons. So you would have to put in fire breaks, you'd have to do a lot of thinning and that sort of stuff. You'd still have a risk of fires, you'd have just reduced a low risk. But you would have changed the appearance of the Adirondack Park. Bulldozers and heavy equipment to do the kinds of things that would matter. I think you'd end up spending a lot of socio-political capital to try to do something that doesn't matter very much, and it would be better to spend those resources, both social and financial, on addressing other problems in the Adirondacks, like invasive species or like flooding. Those other things are probably much greater concerns at that scale of policy. Now, policy exists at lots of different scales, right down to your home. And at that level, things that Liz said, do you have pine needles on your roof? Probably rake those off, right? So take some sort of precautionary measures. I live in a wooden house surrounded by blueberries and pine trees. That's probably one of the more flammable ecosystem types within the forest. I still don't lose a lot of sleep, but I've got some distance between my house and the woods. So educate yourself a little bit about how fires spread, about the kinds of things that might make your personal home a little safer, but probably don't bring picket signs down to Albany and try to advocate for major changes in fire policy.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses. So we have the opportunity to take a few questions from the audience. So what we'll do is I'm going to grab this microphone here from you. And what we'll do is we'll go right down the line. We'll start with Tom Curiali and get questions for him. We can have time for 2 questions for each person. Okay? Questions for Tom. Right here in front.
Tom, you gave the impression that New York State, regardless, if they see a fire, will put it out on forest preserve lands. Is that true?
I can't speak to that fully. I do not know. I work on industry property. I don't work on state, so I don't know what the overarching forest fire policy is of New York State. Yeah, if you could.
From my sample size of 3 DEC foresters and forest rangers that I spoke with, that suppression is always intended. And what that looks like varies widely on the type of fire and where the fire is, but that is a goal, is to suppress fire.
Sally, one more point on that. More of where I'm coming from with that is what I've seen in my experience on the firefighting side of things, that we just go put it out. There's not much consideration in the early planning stages of an incident of not doing that.
Your comment on
I thought I saw another hand for Tom.
Nicole, I've got one back here first. I'm over
Okay,
here in front of you. Hi, over here.
There we are.
Hi, Tom. As you being a forester, do you think it's important for, if we're looking at landowners, and this is, a couple acres up to larger private holders, one thing that I'm always worried about is if we're giving a recommendation on, let's say, clearing the fuel ladders, but we're favoring, landowners need to know that they're favoring some species over the other by doing things like that, doing different management. So, what we do a lot is say, hey, if you're looking at doing, if you have an acre, you can kind of get away with it. But if you get a few acres, we strongly recommend talking to a professional, either forester or agency staff, because again, if you're looking at, and I'm not a birder, but I just say the Tweety birds, maybe taking out all the lower quality trees that we perceive for industrial forestry is not the best thing for it. So making sure that landowners are able to communicate and work with a forester to achieve their goals is good. And some of it could be that removal of the lesser quality and then having better regeneration come back. But I assume that's what you would say, being a forester. But
Yes, this ties back to the first conversation that every forester has with every landowner when they meet them the first time to figure out what their goals and objectives are for the property. If fuel management is a big goal that somebody has for their property, you're going to come up with objectives to do that. If it's a property like Justin's, where you're in an area where there's a higher fire risk, that might be something that the landowner is more akin to want to do. But if you're not in the wildland-urban interface, if you're in a property where they're not as worried about that, their goals may be different, and then your objectives will be far different. But definitely, this ties back to the landowner's wants and needs and how you're going to address that as a forester. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. I do believe we have time for one more question. I know I saw one hand over here for Tom before we pass it on to Liz.
So not really a question for you, Tom, sorry, and not really a question, but just a different perspective maybe on that. I think it was the second question. There's a really amazing, about 13, 14, 15-minute long video on the Pagami Creek fire in Minnesota in 2011. So that was in the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness area, an area that has a very similar forest type as where we are now. and also is 67% water. So this is a canoe wilderness. And the Forest Service was monitoring that fire for a while. They sent staff out in front of the fire to make sure people were cleared of the campsites within what they thought was a very safe buffer. Fire made a run. It ended up burning 93,000 acres. The Forest Service crews that were sent out to evacuate camps, they could not find an island small enough or devoid enough vegetation to not catch fire. And one of the team actually deployed their emergency fire shelters in the water, hanging onto their canoes. So our reference period, a human lifespan, is too short to really understand questions like that, I think, or experiences.
Okay, now Tom, I'll have you pass the mic over to Liz. Let's get a couple questions for Liz if we have them. See one over here on the side.
Hi, Rich Hanlon, naturalist and Adirondack licensed guide. And as a bird nerd, I have a question around birds and fire. Now, there's a number of species of birds that I'm aware of in New York State, in the Adirondacks in particular, where forests are either preserved or managed for their flourishing. One is the endangered spruce grouse. The other is the species of special concern in our higher elevations, bicknose thrush. However, there is a third species that is probably even more rare than either of those two that I just mentioned. It's the yellow-capped, frosty-backed, chisel-beaked sculptor known as the American three-toed woodpecker. If there are any other bird nerds in the room, you might know what I'm talking about, or who I'm talking about. This is a species of bird that flourishes in the wake of fires due to bark beetle outbreaks in response to trees that have been burned that are more susceptible to being infested by the bark beetles. So my question to you is, are you aware of any conversations around fire as a means to perhaps cultivate habitat for the American three-toed woodpecker? Or has that ever been a conversation in any of your circles? I'm imagining that their population probably improved in the wake of the 1903 and 1908 wildfires. But we've had wildfire suppression for a while. So I'd like to hear your response.
Thank you for that and that tip and bird information. I love it. So no, the short answer is no. But this is really great. I think this is why conferences like this are amazing with networking and bringing awareness to this. In general, just from a policy perspective, our state land management plan has nothing about prescribed burns in it. And then again, if it's on private land, we generally we try to provide in our permitting process for the public, some input on how you could enhance wildlife habitat. So I think that's a really great thing to bring up. I don't know, maybe Aaron can say otherwise, but I don't think we've ever had a landowner come and specifically ask us about prescribed burns, but on their property. But maybe they will in the future.
Any other questions for Liz? See a few. I'm going to take it to the back here.
Hi. Yeah, so you did just say that there has been no history of prescribed burns, but given the fact that we are in a changing climate and that, that's undeniable that it's going to continue to change, are prescribed burns going to be utilized like they are being utilized in Ganundagan and Albany?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. And from the APA standpoint, we have no policy on that. We don't think or talk about prescribed burns as a management technique. And again, on state land, we also don't have anything in our state land management plan that refers to that. That's a very good DEC question for public lands and managing it. But I don't think that there's a reason that we would rule out new tools in our toolbox as our landscape and our climate is changing.
Got time for one more question for Liz.
Thanks to all three of you for, I think, what was a positive message, thank God, about forest fires, at least in the near future in the Adirondacks. Do any of you have similar positivity you can offer regarding the Canadian fires, or is this the new normal that we have to deal with for the near future.
I'm going to go first because I know very little about this. I'll give it to you, Justin. What's going on in Canada is there's this trifecta of really, really dry, what is it, high pressure? That is has been sitting there for years, so it's drying out these boreal forests. And then there was also several diseases that have wiped through that area. So there are a lot of dry, standing, dead timber. As that relates here to the park, one side note I was going to mention, and I'm just thinking of it now, is if you do have any damaged, dead, or diseased trees on your property, by all means take them down. You don't even need a permit for that. Okay. If they pose a risk for fire.
Salvage was mentioned earlier. With respect to the windstorms in the 50s in 1995. If that happens again, do take your pickets to Albany and advocate against it. There's a lot of good reasons to do salvage, and I'm not categorically opposed for it. But to reduce fire risk is not one of the good reasons. It's actually one of the worst things you can do. The stuff you're salvaging, the stuff you're removing, the logs, that's not the fire risk fuel. The fire risk fuel is the stuff you're leaving behind. It's the tops, it's the twigs and stuff. And now they're going from a standing tree to down on the ground where they can be ignited and allow for spread. Plus, you're taking away woodpecker habitat, right? So no, I don't generally advocate for salvage for that purpose. There's other good reasons too. The question initially was about Canada. So remember a couple of years ago, there was also fires. Those were mostly from Quebec. A lot of the smoke now, I think a lot of the fires burning in Canada right now are much further west. It's a different forest type. Actually, in Quebec, it's a very different forest type as well. It's boreal forest. It's much more homogeneous. There's very few roads, so it's a very different situation than what we have. And then, added on top of that, you've got a lot of sort of prepared fuels from other mortality sources. The positive that I take out of it is that this is not unprecedented. If you look back through the history books, there are a number of dark days recorded in New England, various towns and so forth, Boston even, recording days that it was so dark out, and they didn't know why, but it's dark and you could smell sulfur in the air. They thought it was the end of days, right? And those were fires that they now think were coming from the Algonquin National Park. You can find fire scars that date to the same year as the recorded dark day in 1780 whatever in Boston. This does happen periodically. Those northern forest types are one of those low frequency, high intensity types. So you will periodically, every many decades to centuries, get big fires. It is not the first time this has happened. Just the first time you remember.
Let's see if we've got one or two more questions to direct to Justin. All right, I want to see if we can call on someone we haven't called on before. So I'm going to bring it back here to the gentleman in the green.
In the last, I don't know how many years it's been now, but the white pines are dropping their needles twice a year. I live in an area where it's nothing but white pine. It's 3 inches thick. Talk about a fuel. What's going on with that?
Same thing with me. I have 30 acres of white pine, and some of them just look like ghosts in June. So that's a needle cast. So it's actually a variety of different fungus. There's more than one organism involved. And that infects the needles early in the year when they're first starting to come out and those candles are starting to expand. So particularly when you have moist springs. And we've had a couple of moist springs, and we may have a lot more moist springs. So that's really conducive to that infection getting started, and then the symptoms show up actually the next year in the needles falling off prematurely. So that's one of, many of this category of diseases called needle cast. It doesn't usually kill the tree. Some of them seem to be affected much more than others, but it does reduce their growth rate, makes them look horrible, and it throws down leaf litter, right? Fortunately for us, fire season in the Northeast, leaving aside those exceptional years where it's drought all summer long, for us, fire season is not usually summer. It's spring and a little bit in fall. And that's not when that needle cast is happening. That needle cast is happening when you've got lots of leafy vegetation in the understory, lots of shade, rain. So generally speaking, not something I worry about from a fire risk perspective, something I worry about from a forest health perspective. Interestingly, the solution from a fire risk perspective is probably the same from a forest health perspective. The more space between the trees, the better aerated, the better ventilated those trees are, the less they tend to get that. You'll notice if you look at them, it's the lower branches that get it much worse than the upper branches that are up in the sun and in the wind. So thin your forest.
Nicole, I have a question back here.
So you made a comment kind of in passing that the forests, the northern hardwood forests specifically, I think you said, are different now than they were in 1908, which is obviously there's been a lot of succession, but then you said they're different than they were in 1808. So that sort of got me thinking about first growth versus old growth. And I know people have talked about red spruce not coming back in northern hardwoods. So do you have any quick, easily digestible insights about that?
One word, beech. Right. So they're different in a lot of ways. They're younger, they're more homogeneous. They're all basically one big age class right now, whereas the pre-settlement, for lack of a better word, the 1600s, 1800, or much older forest, it would have been a more diverse, a more age class diverse forest structure. But a big part of that forest, a big part of the composition of the northern hardwood forest prior to 1800, prior to 1950, was American beech. Very important tree from a wildlife perspective, very important ecologically. It's long-lived, it's shade tolerant. It's one of these it's not at all fire adapted. You light a match next to it, you'll kill it. But it was a dominant tree throughout a lot of the northern forest, a lot of the Adirondacks. Wildlife value is enormous. It produces a valuable, very nutritious. If you ever get a chance to taste one, beech nuts are delicious, and all the animals think so too. But around, let's see, would have been in the 70s actually, that beech bark disease reached this part of the country, and it just destroyed the beech population. So there's a few resistant trees. Every once in a while you run across one. They're beautiful things. But the vast majority of the beech that you see now are either dead or they're severely infected. They have blisters all over their bark. Their crown looks terrible. So that has radically changed. There's all these downstream effects from taking a keystone species out like that. And the modern forest is not like that at all. It's probably a little more flammable, but because beech is very not flammable, but that's the least of my concerns with the loss of beech. And now, so that came in kind of from the east and north. Now we've got coming up from the south something called beech leaf disease, which will take care of all the beech that weren't killed by beech bark disease, I'm afraid. It'll take a little while. But yeah, there's these diseases, invasive species. I think that you should be losing sleep over that rather than fire.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses, guys. Let's see. I'm going to turn it to my timekeeper here, see if we have time for one more question. Okay. So, exactly. So we're going to have one more question to round out this panel.
Did you rookie in Fairbanks?
Yes.
What year?
79 through 81.
Boatner?
Boatner? Tom Boat?
Was Boat rookie in that year?
Tom Boatner, yeah.
Alaska Fire Service for 20 years.
Oh.
So we'll talk about it over beer.
Well, thank you. It sounds like we've got some more natural connections here going on. Thank you all so much for your feedback and participating in this panel. Let's have a round of applause for our foresters.